January was actually such a good reading month for me. I don't know what it was about 2024, but it was such an average reading year for me. My average rating was pretty low, and I ended up with only 2 5-star books the whole year. But guess what? I got 2 5-star books just in January itself. So I think 2025 is already off to an amazing reading year. I only hope we keep this momentum up. Before we continue, let me know how your January reading went and whether you felt the same about 2024 and if January ended up being a lot better for you or not. Also, comment down below what your favorite read of January was. Now let's dive into all the books I managed to finish in January and also all the books I DNF'd. For those of you who don't know, DNFs means did not finish, so any books that I started but didn't really have the motivation to continue. The first book I finished was Unforgiven, which is the first book in the Lexa Winter series. So I actually started this book last year, and as hard as I tried, I didn't manage to finish reading it before 2025. So I think I read about 40% of the book this last month. Disclaimer, I don't usually like stories that glamorize, glorify the police, anything like that, but I was given a copy of the fourth book in this series by a publisher, so I wanted to start from the start. I was so disappointed with how this book turned out. It started off really promising, and as a fan of Criminal Minds, I thought the setup and the storyline was really interesting. So the series revolves around Lexi Winter, who had a rough start, and she is now sort of a vigilante. Her paths cross with the police, who are investigating a case that has now reopened because a couple of years ago they thought they caught the killer, but something has come up that now implies that maybe they didn't get the right person. The story switches between first and third person actually, which is a little confusing. I don't mind switching POVs, but as long as the person tense, is that the right word? As long as that stays the same. So if it's all first person, if it's all third person, etc., that's fine. But when we're in Lexi's point of view, we have first person, and then when we switch to the detective of the case that's reopened, her chapters are in third person. I'm not sure why that choice was made exactly, but it was a little confusing and I didn't love it so much. And then unfortunately, as the story went on, the characters became a little bit more cartoonish, is the word I used to describe it, in that they felt like caricatures of themselves. So some of the things that they were saying, their reactions, it just didn't feel like they were real people in the real world. And I know it's a fiction book, but it is set in contemporary times with real life settings and places. So it just felt weird that grown-ups, adults who were part of the police force, they were all acting like children. I'm sorry to say it. The writing just felt so amateurish that the characters came off as very childish. So yeah, it was hard to overlook that, and everything was happening in a way that just felt really unrealistic. It was hard for me to get caught up in the story because of that. I just kept pausing and being like, this is ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous. I'm hoping that the rest of the series gets better because I am going to continue it. Like I said, I received the fourth book from the publisher, so I do want to give it a shot. And I don't like reading series out of order, even if you don't need to read the other books in the series to understand the current one. I just prefer reading them all in order. I ended up rating it 2 stars. Next up, we have Celestial Monsters, which is the second book in the Sunbearers duology. This was also another disappointment. I really enjoyed the first book. I thought it was so fun. It was so fast paced and I just loved the characters. Yes, I did read a little on the younger side of YA, but I think because it was just so exciting, I could overlook it and I didn't notice it as much. This book though is so repetitive that I couldn't overlook it. If anything, the writing was just so glaringly middle grade that it was hard to ignore. And I'm not saying middle grade is bad. I love reading middle grade stories, but when a book is marketed as YA and most of the characters are 17 years old and it says that they are multiple times, when your 17-year-olds act like 13-year-olds, it's like, what are we doing? If this was marketed as middle grade and it was written with characters that were maybe a little bit younger, I think it would have been a great story. You get 2 point of views, a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old, and everyone reacts the same way. Like everyone's dialogue, everyone's actions are just very similar to each other in terms of age range. And maybe 4 years doesn't seem like that big of a difference, but a 13-year-old is so different to a 17-year-old. I'm not saying that 17-year-olds are, I feel like I'm saying 17-year-old a lot. I know they're not the epitome of maturity, but there is a difference in how they speak and how they handle things. And also, it just felt like a lot of plot points were wrapped up quite conveniently. I felt like there wasn't enough time dedicated to some things, and the ending also just felt really rushed and convenient. Like, it just didn't make sense why certain people stayed away for a certain period of time. And that sounds really vague, but I don't want to spoil this book, and also definitely don't want to spoil the first book if you haven't read it, since this is the sequel. I ended up rating that 3 stars. I still would recommend the duology as a whole though, if you are looking for more diverse reads. It's just the story itself was not for me. And the next up, I finished The Husbands. I really enjoyed this. It was like a fun, silly time, but it was great. It didn't promise anything more, and I'm glad, because I think what it was perfect. So this book is about a woman who comes home one night to discover a strange man in her house, but he keeps talking to her like they know each other. Turns out he is her husband, and everyone in her life knows this. So before she stepped in the door, didn't have a husband. After she stepped in the door, suddenly her phone has photos of their wedding, photos of them together, her texts to friends and family all reference him as well. And yeah, it's weird. But what's weirder is that when he goes into the attic, he comes back a different man. And this keeps happening. Anytime a man goes up to the attic and he comes back down, it's someone else. But they are all her husbands. Her photos change, the texts change, and also her life changes in small ways, small but significant ways. She's essentially living real life Hinge or Tinder, because if she doesn't like the look of the guy or just anything about him immediately, she can just send him back into the attic and get someone else new to come down. That is the premise of it, and I was worried that it would become repetitive, but I think the pacing of this book was very well done. As soon as it starts getting too similar, the story changes up a little bit, so it stops being predictable. I really like that the characters in this don't pretend to be more than who they are. So what I mean by that is that the main character has her flaws, but it's not like she excuses them or she doesn't try to pretend that she is a better person. She's not super ambitious. She's just like living her life, and she's fine with that. She's not trying to be more than she is. And because of that, there's not a huge like character arc or anything like that, but it works. And I think the author did a great job at that. She knew what she was writing and she kept it in that scope. Don't go into this book expecting anything profound or anything like that, but definitely go into this if you're just wanting a fun, chill book and the premise sounds interesting to you. Oh, I will say that there was one chapter that made me quite uncomfortable, but you'll know it if you get up to it. But I also like the fact that the author doesn't, again, excuse the character from her actions in this chapter. I ended up rating it 4 stars. And then now we're up to my first DNF of the month. This was actually a NetGalley e-arc, and it is a book of poetry. This book is a very personal collection of poetries, so I wanted to remain respectful of that, but unfortunately it just was not to my personal taste at all. One of the reasons is that the poems themselves felt a little bit shallow for me, which is hard to say because, like I said, they're personal. So calling someone's experience shallow is not the best, but I just mean that the poems themselves didn't really hit me that deeply. But again, that is my personal opinion. There are other people I've seen that have liked this collection. The other thing is that I am not a religious person, and I'm nothing against religion itself, but the poems are quite religion themed. I was going to say coded, but it's not coded. It's quite explicit in the poems. She refers to he, him a lot. She explicitly talks about Jesus and God and praying. And to me, again, I just don't really love that. It's not for me personally. So very much it's about me, not them. My own reasons why I didn't want to continue this book, but doesn't mean that it can't be for someone else. Now onto the 4th book I finished in January, and my first 5-star read of the month, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is the 3rd book in the Hercule Poirot series by Agatha Christie. This book blew me away. The ending was incredible. That's all I'm going to say. You should go into this book blind. Don't read up on it. Don't look into the summary. Just read it. Just read it and you'll enjoy yourself. For context, I read the first 3 books in the series over the last year or 2 years, and I didn't really like them. They are in the point of view of Captain Hastings, who I just really do not like. I didn't realize that the book series is going to be in someone else's point of view and not Hercule Poirot himself. And I just really hate Hastings as a character. I feel like he's like very misogynistic, and I know these books are written in a different time, but everyone kind of takes him for like a naive, fumbling fool who's endearing because he's a little bit of an idiot, but he means well. But to me, I don't think he does mean well. I feel like the way he thinks about women and the way he speaks about women just isn't to my taste. So because of that, it clouds my feelings about the books because his character is just so annoying, but I like Hercule Poirot as a character himself. So I was excited to get to a book where we could go into someone else's perspective of the story playing out. I'm really glad that I stuck out this series because I think I was about to give up. Like I said, I like to start from the start. So I didn't start with her more well-known works like Murder on the Orient Express or Death in the Nile. I just wanted to start from the start. And I'm glad that I finally got up to this book because it was incredible. So good. 5 stars. And then I DNF'd my second book of the month, which was Bookworm and the Beast. This book I got from one of those Stuff Your Kindle shelves. So it was a free romance book. Yeah, I don't know. I was just a little bored. This book is about a woman who is a journalist and she writes about books. She also wanted to be an author originally. Her favorite author is this fantasy series author who I think is basically like a younger, hotter version of George R. Martin. And I say that because his name is, I think, Jack R. Bestia, or something like that. Like the RR initials are the same. And he's written this huge series and now he's stuck on like the last book. I know George R. Martin, it's like he's stuck on the next book. But yeah, he's stuck on a book and the fans have been waiting for ages for the next book to come out. This is also like a fairy tale retelling. So Bookworm and the Beast, Beauty and the Beast. Not only is he George R. Martin, he is also the Beast. I mean, yeah, it's as wild as it sounds. The book itself, I don't know how to explain it. It's not giving me much. It's not bad. The writing is fine, but that's the thing. Everything about it is just fine. And I just wasn't that interested in continuing it. And then I read some of the reviews and a lot of them say that the pacing doesn't really get better. And it's a little bit of like an insta-lust, insta-love kind of thing. Like there's not much connection between them. And that's one of my biggest pet peeves when it comes to romance books. So yeah, I had no real desire to finish this. So I didn't. But then I devoured How the King of Elfhame Learned to Hate Stories, which is a set of short stories set in the world of the Folk of the Air series. I ended up devouring it in one sitting. I started reading it at night when I was in bed and I was just going to read a couple of pages, but then I just finished the whole thing. To be fair, it isn't super long, but it was just so intriguing. Like I said, it's a series of short stories. Not all of them are set after Queen of Nothing. Some of them are, well, most of them I think are set as Cardan is growing up as the prince in Elfhame. And yeah, it was interesting to get more insight into his childhood and why he turned out the way he did. As always, just wish there was a little bit more Cardan and Jude because I love them together. But regardless, I really enjoyed these stories. I rated this 4 stars. And then the next book I DNF'd was Always Only You, which is the second book in the Bergman Brothers series. I read the first book last year, I think. I actually have a reading blog on that on my channel if you want to check that out. I was really excited for this series because it revolves around a big family, which I love. And there's also disability rep, neurodivergence rep, all that. It has the makings of a series that I would really love. But unfortunately, it's not for me. And I think the author's writing is not for me. And I think I'm gonna stop trying with her series. I don't like it in romance when you're introduced to the character and they, not just in romance, I guess with any book, but it happens a lot in romance, I think, where the characters are introduced and they explain everything about themselves. They're basically expositioning themselves to you and info dumping everything instead of letting you discover these personality traits, these interests throughout the story. I'm really picky with romances, and one of those things is the showing versus telling. I like discovering characters, who they are as we go through the story because it just feels more natural and I just enjoy reading that more. I don't want 2 full pages of you explaining who you are as a person to me. Also, I mentioned this in the other vlog as well about the first book. I know these were independently published originally, but the versions I'm reading are traditionally published by Penguin. It's almost like these books were not edited because the amount of grammar errors, the amount of typos, it's way too much. I can't remember exactly what sayings were used incorrectly in the last book, but in this book, the character unironically says, "I could care less." And I say unironically because I know sometimes there are grammatical choices you make to suit the character's style or vernacular, just like who they are as a person and how they speak. But in this case, the character says, "I could care less." Seriously. And it just makes me think the author doesn't know the correct saying. And then it makes me mad that there weren't enough editors or there weren't any editors who picked up on this and corrected it. Because what do you mean? What do you mean a simple phrase like "I could care less" was used instead of the correct way, "I couldn't care less"? And then it's not just that, it's you can tell there are a lot of errors in this book that could have been picked up by a copy editor and they're just not, and it frustrates me. And I know for some people it's not that serious, not that deep, but I just feel like it reflects the level of care you have for the book. Like if a publisher's putting that little effort into a book, why would I put in a lot of effort to read through this book if all I can see are the glaring errors. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's reciprocal. I knew that there's no point continuing this book because it's just gonna annoy me and I'm not gonna give it a good rating anyway. The sixth book I finished was Taste My Life Through Food, which is a memoir by Stanley Tucci. I listened to this via audiobook and it's narrated by Stanley Tucci himself, which I actually really adored. I mean, he is an actor and his narration style made the book so much more endearing and so much more fun. Unfortunately, I think I just don't really care about the food stuff that much. Like, I love eating good food. I love food, but I don't think I love food in the same way that Stanley Tucci loves food. A lot of the stories are food related and he has his own personal anecdotes as well, but they're related to food in some way. I mean, it's in the title, the memoir, so I should have known, but I'd heard good things about the book. It just wasn't for me personally. I was a little bored and I feel like if he wasn't narrating it, I probably would have DNF'd the book earlier, but I'm glad I finished it. I ended up rating it 3.5 stars. Next, I finished Love and Other Scores, which is a queer Australian Open romance that I read during the Australian Open. I live in Melbourne and the Oz Open was on. I didn't actually go to the Oz Open this year. I don't think I ever really have been, but it was kind of cool to see it on TV, have the vibes of the Oz Open at the same time that I was reading this book. Unfortunately, that was the only part of the book I liked. So the story is about a famous tennis star who falls in love with a bartender who's just a regular old guy who doesn't know who he is. And yeah, it's like a celebrity fan fiction, I guess you could say. The start of this book was promising, but it quickly went downhill for me when the insta love between the characters happened. And I think I mentioned it earlier in the video, but I hate insta love. I don't hate insta lust that much because lust is like a different thing. As long as they are aware that they're only physically attracted to each other and there's no other connection, I'm fine with that. But if there's like an instant connection, like a bone deep need to like be with them and always thinking about them, even though they've barely spoken like 10 words to each other, I'm not on board with that. I can't get behind it. It's like, I don't know who you are as like individual people. How do you know how you guys are? How can you know enough? How do you have enough information to feel a connection? Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm just being cynical and like it happens in real life too. Why does it matter? It's not about that. It's like if I'm reading a book, I need to feel more than that to actually believe in the characters. I can't just be told that they're in love. I need to feel it. Sorry, I feel like I just went on like a mini rant there. I've just been reading a lot of bad romances recently and romance is actually one of my favorite genres. So it's just disappointing that I just keep reading bad romance books. It feels like the insta love, the rushed connections, it's happening a lot lately. And then aside from that, there were other problems I had with this book as well. The pacing I thought was really weird. It was almost like, and I don't know how to explain this without going to spoiler territory, so I'm going to try to keep it vague and hopefully it still makes sense. It was almost like, also sorry about the lighting. I'm just filming in natural light and the sun keeps moving. Almost like there were so many little obstacles to overcome, but it's like little quests that were completed and then just moved on from. So the characters would find a certain obstacle in their relationship, they would overcome it, and the next one, the next one, the next one. It wasn't like there were little problems that kind of like slowly cropped up and then you know that it's going to culminate into the climax of the story. It was literally just like, oh, this is a thing. They deal with it one chapter, next chapter they move on to something else. So it just never felt like it came together or was cohesive because these little things would just be dealt with one at a time, which probably happens in real life. In a story though, I feel like what you should have is like little bits of things that could go wrong and then you see it all kind of go wrong in that third act, breakup, climax part of the story, which I know some people don't like, but I've read enough books now that I understand the general structure of stories and how they should kind of go and like the flow of it to make it work. This book just did not like adhere to any of that, which is fine sometimes. Like I know that not all books need to be traditionally structured, but also it means that the story just feels a little bit off. Like the pacing is weird. You can't quite keep up with it. And I think books in general, they shouldn't be predictable, but they shouldn't be completely like what's going on at all, especially in a romance book. This one, even though I know there's going to be a happy ending, it just felt a little bit like disjointed for me. Also, I just feel like we never got to know the characters really well and we just never delved deep into their fears and their worries before those fears and worries were resolved or worked out, which meant that when things went right, I felt like I wasn't that invested in it. With all those complaints, it feels like it's a 1-star book, but it's actually 2 stars. I didn't love it, but I did enjoy the heart of the story and I think the author definitely has promise. And then I DNF'd What the Wife Knew because for a thriller book, this story was incredibly boring to me. I just did not care at all what was happening. I don't think I even got that far into the story. I just never wanted to pick it up. And every time I was reading it, I was like, I don't want to anymore. So there's no point continuing a book that you don't like, and I DNF'd it. But luckily, immediately after putting this down, I picked up We Used to Live Here, which is a horror book mainly, but it's thriller as well. This was my second 5-star read of the month, and it was so good. This book is an example of characters that are realistic in an unrealistic situation. I never felt frustrated with the characters. I felt like these are all things that I would have done if I was in the character's shoes. And I think that just ties the story together a lot more. You're not kind of like caught up in the absurdity of the situation. You're in for the ride. Also, I don't even like horror, but this was just done so perfectly. I love the pacing of this book. I love the intrigue of the book. I really needed to know what was going to happen at all times. I was like hooked from the beginning, and I don't think the story let me go once. I didn't know much about this book or anything actually before going in, and I'm so glad about that. Definitely think you should go in blind. I think with any horror books, thriller books, personally I think all books, but especially thriller books, you definitely should go in blind so you're not expecting things to happen, or you're not kind of anticipating how the story is going to play out. I will say though that it is a haunted house story. The main character is Eve, and she and her partner just bought a place that they're gonna renovate and then resell. But one night when Charlie is out, Eve opens the door to her family. The dad, husband of the family, says that he used to grow up there, and they're passing by and he wants to take his family on a tour of the place. After much hesitation, Eve lets them in, and that's kind of where the story starts. Honestly, I cannot stop thinking about this book. It's been a couple weeks since I finished it, and I'm still like ruminating on it. When I finished this book, I immediately went on to Reddit to hear what other people thought, to look at discussions that were had about what the book is actually about, the theories of what happened, the ending. There are definitely opposing theories of what the story is or what actually happened. I have my own kind of beliefs of what I think. It's definitely more towards one side than the other. I won't say anything else besides that though, because I don't want to spoil it. It's just so good. And even though I was satisfied with the ending, I really wish there was more. I want to read more so badly. Also, you do get left with a lot of questions at the end of the book, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing in this case. I think the author has given us enough clues to try to figure it out ourselves, or to like kind of let us seep in the mystery, and I think that's a good thing. I think not all books have to have the answers written out for you. It doesn't need to handhold you, and this book definitely, I think, sets it up enough for you to discuss with other people, for you to really try to figure it out yourself. Apparently there might be a sequel. I'm not entirely sure. I've just heard rumors about that on these Reddit threads that I've been reading. I really want there to be a sequel. I want to know more, but I'm also happy with how it ended. Just can't stop thinking about it. And like I said, my second 5-star read of the month. And then after being so enamored with that book, I sadly DNF'd Tom Lake. I was listening to this on audiobook even before I read the last book, but I think when I went back to this audiobook after reading We Used to Live Here, it just felt really lackluster for me. It's a completely different book, so I mean, I know that. Just when I was listening to this audiobook, I just didn't feel that captivated by it. I felt kind of bored actually, and it's like narrated by Meryl Streep, so I really should be so into it, but the story itself is not that interesting to me. I've only heard good things about this book though, so it is a soft DNF for now. I think I just wasn't in the mood for a slow literary book. Also, I think the audio was a little bit confusing because it switches between the past and the present, and there were a lot of names as well, and audiobooks for me are confusing when that happens, when there's like different timelines and there are a lot of characters. So if I do end up picking this book back up, I might need to do it in a different format. And then because I didn't have that audiobook, I picked another audiobook to listen to. This one was A Proposal They Can't Refuse. This is a romance, and the premise was interesting. It was promising, but similar to the last book, I think I just wasn't that interested in continuing it. This is also a soft DNF. I don't have a huge desire to pick it back up, but I also think it could be a sweet romance. That is it. That is my January wrap up. I was hoping that I wouldn't have that many DNFs this year. Like I would be pickier with the books that I pick up, but it is what it is. I know that if I continue with the book I don't like, I'm just gonna head into a slump. So I like to DNF as soon as I know, as soon as I have a feeling, just to avoid that slump. And look, I'm happy that I managed to get 2 5-star reads. All of 2024 was 2. So I'm happy that January has managed to produce really good reads for me. And I know we're almost halfway into February, but I am hoping that the rest of this month will be just as good as January or even better. Let me know how your February reading is going. And if you've read any of the books I read last month, what were your thoughts on it? And whether I've inspired you to add any of these to your TBR. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.